Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy. I'm Steve, and we are a proud member of the Agora Podcast Network. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and you can find both by searching for A2Z History. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. And I would love for you to really send in your questions, especially your questions about music, because I am planning a Q&A episode, and church music will be a big part of that, where we will hopefully be able to get Jeffrey Tucker back on to answer some of your questions. So definitely tweet those questions, Facebook me, email me. You can even record the question and send it as a clip, and that would be awesome too. But please send in those questions. Before we get started, I'd like to thank a listener, Richard Liddell, for purchasing me Saints and Sinners, A History of the Popes by Eamon Duffy. This is a great book, and Richard, you can bet I'll be using this book extensively and preparing many an episode for many years to come. So you've really given me a true gift that will last hopefully a lifetime. You can support this podcast in so many ways like Richard did, including purchasing books from the Amazon wish list, sending in feedback, purchasing some merchandise, History of the Papacy merchandise at a2zhistory.com/products, and just by listening and telling a friend, sending in an iTunes review. All of those things are really helpful for me to do a better job in making this podcast, and it helps me learn a little bit more about what you're thinking, and I love to hear that. So send in those questions too for the Q&A episode. Today we have a special collaboration episode with Mike Corradi of the podcast A History of Italy. I just can't say how much I enjoy this show, A History of Italy. It's so well researched and presented. It's funny, informative, entertaining, like everything you'd really want in a podcast. A History of Italy really has one of the best topics going out there, Italy. I love the history of Italy. I think it's the history of Italy central to everything that goes on in Europe and Africa and the Middle East. You can't tell the story of any of those without telling the history of Italy. In this particular collaboration, we are talking about a group of people who came into Italy during the fall of the Ostrogothic kingdom and during the Byzantine Wars, namely the Lombards. They were another Germanic people that made life interesting, to say the least, for the population of Italy. Mike will get us up to speed with the Lombards and give us a little taste of his show as well. If you want to learn more about A History of Italy podcast, you can learn more at his website, historyofitaly.com, and the link to that will, of course, be in the show notes. I want to thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Welcome back to a very special crossover episode with A History of Italy podcast and the History of the Papacy podcast. I'm Steve, host of the History of the Papacy podcast, and I'm joined by...
I'm Mike, and I am the host of A History of Italy podcast.
Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Well, first of all, Steve, I really want to say an important thing, which is the History of the Papacy is one of the 4 or 5 podcasts that actually made me want to start podcasting. So, as is the case, I'm sure in with many podcasters, you start off as a listener and you think, God, this is great. I love to do this. And so I had, for example, the history of England, and I had the history of English, and then relatively quickly I got to the history of the Papacy. And then after that, I started to listen to some lower quality podcasts, and they're the ones that made me decide that I could try it as well. So thanks for the inspiration there. So
you far surpassed mine. So
no, not at all, not at all. So my podcast is basically a history of the Italian peninsula. Let's call it that way, because you never really know when you can start calling the country Italy. unless you start, in 1860 with the unification. And so it goes from the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and if I ever get there, all the way up to present day.
Yeah, I'm definitely loving your show. Once I discovered it, I've been binge listening on it. There's a lot of great information in there because Italy really seems like that's the history of Europe. So many different of the themes of the whole European history go through Italy.
Yeah, and then everybody's always invading us all the time. So unfortunately, after we spent years and years and centuries invading other people under the Roman Empire, then we what goes around comes around, So yeah. Also, I think, I have the advantage of having local sources as well. So, I can always pop down to the library and get more in-depth things that perhaps you can get on the web or you can get elsewhere, let's say.
Yeah, definitely. That's got to help immensely.
Definitely, yeah.
And then my podcast is the History of the Papacy podcast, which is a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome along with the Christian church. It's a kind of a grab bag. I do histories of, especially I talk a lot about the formation of the Bible, but along with the early foundation of Christianity. Now that I'm starting to go a little bit forward, there's a lot more talk about history that's happening inside of Italy. So our podcasts definitely run parallel to each other.
Absolutely. And one thing I've always appreciated, and I generally tell my listeners to go over and listen to your podcast for, is the theological aspect, which is, very often over my head. And so I say, well, if you want to know about that, go over to the History of the Papacy and listen to that. So yeah, definitely, yeah, because Rome is, smack bang in the middle of Italy, and there's no getting around it, not only from a geographical point of view, but also from a political point of view to this very day. I mean, Rome and the papacy influences Italian politics even today to a certain extent, obviously not as much as in the past, but they're still there and they're still influencing things here.
Yeah, it really is amazing how the papacy and the church, the impact and the effect changes in each era of history. It's a little different, but it's still pretty deeply entwined in the whole bigger story.
Absolutely, definitely, yes. And from some moments when Italian history probably wouldn't proceed without the intervention of the papacy, to moments where they're sort of more of a bystander to events than in other times.
That really leads us into what we were going to what we plan on talking about today, which is the history of the Lombards in Italy. You did a really great series on them, and I thought I've been doing in my podcast little snippets, especially with experts such as yourself, on different political elements that were going on in Italy that affected the church and the popes. And the Lombards is a huge part of the story, and they're really complicated. What did you think about the Lombards just in general?
Well, I actually really enjoyed them. Obviously, as having gone to school in Italy, I did have an idea of who they were and what they'd done, but I really didn't get a feel of it until I was actually studying them. So I thought they were an odd bunch. They were fun. Obviously, it's interesting to look at Italians in Italy today and think that such a different people were part of the shared Italian history. I mean, we're talking Vikings, basically, people that came down from Scandinavia, then, spent some centuries even making their way through Europe down to Italy. And it was very interesting to see that was such an important part of Italian history, and also for your listeners of the papacy, because we must remember that under the Lombards, the papacy really became a political force to reckon with, starting with Gregory the Great, which you've done a couple of episodes recently on, all the way down to the donation of Sutri, which was one of the main starting points of the papal states, really. So they're definitely an interesting bunch, and I enjoyed them, and I was a bit sorry to see them go and those Franks coming in and pushing them out. And so, but they hung around a lot longer than one would expect, and there's traces of them to this day. So I enjoyed them very much.
Where did the Lombards come from exactly? They existed outside of the Roman Empire, and they came into Italy after the Western Roman Empire had fallen. They were kind of late in the later part of the whole migration game, what were they doing, say in the maybe the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries before they came into Italy proper?
Well, it's hard to tell exactly what they were doing because they have no written history. Nothing was written down by the Lombards until they actually did get to Italy when they wrote down their laws, and maybe we'll talk about that later, the Edict of Rothari. But basically in that time they were wandering down Europe from Scandinavia, collecting bits here and there, because they obviously, the people that arrived in Italy in 568 in particular with King Alboin were not the people that started off from their original. They didn't even have the same name, actually, because they actually started off life as the Winili, which means something like either fierce in battle or demon dogs, because apparently they would wear, I don't know if they would chop off dogs' heads and wear them, or they would make dog masks or something like that, but some traces of Roman historians have had them looking like or wearing some kind of dog costume to make them more fierce in battle. And so as they came down, they actually met other tribes, other Germanic tribes, in some cases integrating, some cases clashing. And for example, the clash with the Vandals is where they changed their names to the Lombards, because basically they came up against these Vandals, and legend would have it that on the night before the battle, the Lombard women went to the goddess Freya, the wife of Wotan or Odin, the Germanic god of all gods, let's say, and asked for her help. And so basically Odin had promised that the winner of the battle between the Winili, or would become the Lombards, and the Vandals would be the first ones he saw on the morning of the battle. So Freya, his wife, suggested to the Lombard women that they should put their hair down in front of their faces and stand next to the Lombard men, so their number looked greater, and then Odin would see them on the day. And so that they did, and it seems that Odin woke on that day, saw them, and asked himself, who are those warriors with the long beards? Now, long beards in German would be Langebärte, which in Italian became Longobardi, so the long beards, and that's why they changed their name from the Winili to the to Lombards in English, and they even gave their name to an existing Italian region, which is Lombardy, where Milan is the capital. So that's what they were doing. Basically, they were making their way down, changing names, meeting and greeting other Germanic tribes, and in some cases clashing, some cases absorbing them into their social structure, let's say.
It's a pretty big deal to change the name of an entire region, especially in a place that's as well established as that northern part of Italy. How did they come? Did they come en masse with families, or was it more of just a warrior elite that had migrated?
Well, the first time they actually had a taste and experience of Italy was as part of the Byzantine invasion force that fought against the Goths in Italy. Up until that point, the Goths had held, for a couple of decades, had held Italy. And when the Byzantines, under the eunuch Narses, invaded Italy, Gothic Italy, they brought a contingent of Lombards with them, and that's where they experience where the Lombards had a taste of Italy for the first time. Apparently they were so naughty and raucous and, misbehaved that they were sent off earlier than, they didn't get to see the end of the war, but they got to see Italy and they liked it. So when time came, at that time they would have been in what was known as Pannonia, which is a region sort of modern day Austria, a little bit of Slovenia, just up on the border of Italy. And so when the time came and it was getting a bit crowded there, they were sort of pushing and shoving. They'd done a bit of pushing and shoving with the Gepids, which are another sort of Gothic group, and now they were risking a push and shove with the Avars. And so they said, okay, well, rather than keep on staying here, we'll just go down, to the land of milk and honey and taking over Italy was a relatively easy task by that time because it had been devastated and was sort of chafing under the yoke of Byzantine rule. And so it was a pretty easy thing to come down and to take over quite a bit of the peninsula.
Is that why it happened so fast? Because there was a vacuum in the peninsula where the Byzantines weren't 100% committed and the Ostrogoths were pretty much wiped out? Is that what made it so easy for them to go into the Italian peninsula and take over so rapidly?
That's definitely part of it, yeah. The administration under Narses was very unpopular. The country during the Gothic War had suffered from all kind. I mean, you know, it's in Italian we'd say piove sul bagnato. It rains where it's already wet. So in English, I suppose you'd say something like, you know, never rains but it pours. So not only had there been the Gothic War, but you'd also had famine. You'd had pestilence. So the people were decimated. There were certain areas of Italy which had been, you know, completely and totally depopulated. The area where I live, for example, Emilia. Everyone had migrated down to the sea. And so, you know, in many cases, there was just, you know, nobody to oppose the Lombards. The Byzantines, as you were saying, Steve, weren't that dedicated. Narses had a terrible time trying to rebuild, you know, the rubble of a country that had suffered years and years of war with very little finances as well. So he'd had to sort of tax the pants out of the poor locals, and obviously they weren't loving that. So it really was relatively simple for the Lombards to come in to Italy and invade Italy, because it was different. Because whereas the Goths came in as what would be called federati, sort of allies of the empire, the Lombards were an actual invasion force, so they had no sort of illusion of you know, being allies with the empire. And they would have come in, let's say, the second time, not as a band of warriors affiliated with an invasion force, but that would have been sort of a mass migration. Now, obviously, numbers there are almost impossible, but, you know, the one I see recurring most often is about 150,000 people, which is, you know, not so much considering the local population as well. But they came in and they were able to become the elite of the country and to take over the positions of power. And it was one case in which really those that suffered most from an invasion, once the invasion was over, were those at the top. So, you know, the Italian or Roman nobles were either killed or exiled, whereas once the invasion had finished, the lower levels of societies didn't have a terrible time of it, also because they had sort of similar social situations, economic situations without the Byzantine taxes. So you could say, in a certain sense, things improved a bit for the lower levels of society.
You might say that the lower levels, they weren't maybe ecstatic about it, but it was kind of the same thing, different people.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the initial invasion would have been something terrible, you know, with the pillaging and sacking. But, you know, if you were able to survive that, then it wasn't as bad as maybe it was under the Byzantines, where you had all of the problems of, you know, daily life in the early Middle Ages, plus very heavy Byzantine taxations, which the Lombards didn't apply.
Where did the Lombards obviously came in through the north? Where were their major power centers once they were in the Italian peninsula?
Well, they came in through the northeast, in the area of Cividale, what was once known as the Julian Alps, basically. And that was actually where they left their first duke. The name duke comes from the term dux, which is a Roman term meaning leader or commander. And so the first duke was set there in Cividale. And as I say in my podcast, King Alboin, who took the Lombards in, actually did something which my children never managed to do, which is shut the door behind him, in the sense that he created a fortification there in Cividale against future invasions. Indeed, the future problems for the Lombards didn't come from that area, but then came from the west, from the Franks. And so basically, as they came down, Well, we really need to take a step back, because one thing we need to say about the Lombards is they were not a united people, really. Alboin was only actually the second king that had managed to unite them as a people, and they were really off doing their own thing. They had all different groups. The tribal groups of the Lombards were called fare, one fara, a single fara. And so everybody was really off doing their own thing once they'd settled. So the main centers, they in some cases, they used existing cities. So, for example, Verona, Pavia, Milan. In other cases, they would create other centers. So, for example, there was an important Roman city which was Aquileia, and they didn't settle Aquileia, but it settled nearby and created their own city. They would create settlements in areas, obviously, as people have done since ancient times, around rivers, around crossings, around bridges. And so in the north, they had those centers. And going further south, they went as far south as Benevento and Spoleto. And those are two big names, because the dukes of Benevento and Spoleto, in all of the history of the Lombards, were always causing some kind of trouble. All of the dukes were very, very ready to try and be as independent as they could. But in particular, the dukes of Benevento and Spoleto were quite far off. They were cut off by what became then the Papal States and what were the remaining Byzantine holdings. So they were far enough to do their own thing and cause trouble without the king trying to intervene. Indeed, at the beginning, the Lombards got rid of they didn't elect any kings after their second king in Italy, which was Clef. He died in 574. And so between 574 and 584, they did without kings. They said, okay, well, everybody do your own thing. Everybody manage your own bit of the country. But then with the Franks looming ever present over in the west, they said, okay, maybe we need a king. And then back in 584, they elected Authari as king. And from then on, they had a central power in the king from then on until the end of their reign. But for example, the dukes, the duchies of Spoleto and Benevento actually survived beyond the fall of the northern Lombard Empire as well. So they were quite important historically.
I guess to fill in the timeline a little bit, what happened at that time in the northern part of their kingdom?
At that time
after they had settled, they made a kingdom, a unified kingdom. But then when the Franks hit the scene, why did the Franks come in and have a conflict with the Lombards in the northern part of of Italy?
Well, that depends how far you want to go down the line, because I know that in your podcast, Steve, you're sort of just getting to the Lombards. But, well, basically the Franks had always been peeking over the Alps, let's say. Also in the times of the Gothic War, they had, done a little bit of raiding coming in. So one of the tasks of Narses, of the Byzantine ruler, when he'd won the Gothic War, was to get rid of the Franks. So, one was just basically northern Italy. In particular, the Po Valley it's a very fertile area, and it's the only area, if you have a chance to look on a map, the Po Valley is the only non-mountainous fertile area of Italy, and it's very good for farming, and it has the Po River running through the center, so it's always been an area that's ripe for conquest, basically. But in time, and this is something perhaps that's more interesting for you and your listeners, the Franks came to the aid of the Papacy. Obviously, we're looking quite a bit down the line, and in the end, the Lombard kingdom of the north actually fell because of their continuous, let's say, encroachment on papal lands and the risk that the Pope saw in being absorbed by the Lombard kingdom. And so that's why once he'd understood, to say the Pope at the moment, understood that there was no more help coming from the Byzantine Empire, then he started to look towards the Franks, and that's when they got the excuse to come and invade and encroach on those important lands as well. And in those years, they were basically setting up a kingdom. So, they slowly managed to settle, so to move from a semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer culture that had basically breeding and farming of animals to a more sedentary agricultural culture. And then later on down the line with another important king, which was Rothari, they set their laws down in writing. And interestingly, those laws made it, for quite a few centuries, the Franks themselves actually used the Lombard code of law of Rothari, and then later extended, let's say, by other kings, for example, Aripert and Liutprand in particular. They set down these laws, and they were very important up until basically Roman law was discovered in the university period. So you're talking, the 11th, 12th centuries. You still had people claiming to live and abide by Lombard law. So centuries after the Edict of Rothari, which was around 653. Mid 600s, let's say. So they were setting up shop, you can say.
That's a good jump into what was their governmental structure in Italy, and generally how did they establish their government, and how did they rule, especially when they're ruling over mostly the local Roman population, Latin, non-Germanic population. How did they interact with them, and how did they organize themselves?
Well, basically at the beginning, they found these strange creatures, these Romans that weren't warriors, and they were normal citizens doing, being farmers or artisans and things like that. So they didn't really initially fit into the whole Lombard philosophy, because, if you were a Lombard, you were part of three groups. So the top group, the top social strata, let's say, were that of the Arimanni, who were the sort of noble warrior lords. Under the Arimanni, you had the Aldi, who were free men, but in some way dependent on the Arimanni. And then you had basically the serfs. And the local Roman population really didn't fit into this structure, so it took a little bit of adapting. But once the Lombards did start to settle down and move to a more sort of agricultural culture, they found that they needed the help of the Roman, let's call them Roman for lack of, Roman or Italian administrators to manage what they'd taken over. And so they were there, the administrators were there and they're ready. And so we see from the beginning of the Lombard conquest, more integration, whereas the Goths had actually tried to keep everything separate and made completely different law systems for Goths or for the Romans. With the Lombards, we see a greater level of integration, a move, for example, one thing that's always interesting for us is drinking. And so the drinking habits, the Lombards came in as drinkers of let's say, beer or mead or, whatever passed for beer back then. They moved in, and slowly in time, especially the upper levels, took to drinking wine. And indeed, by the time of the Edict of Rothari, so we're looking not that long after, about 70 years after the initial invasion, there's no trace of regulations and laws regarding beer, but lots of regulations and laws regarding the protection of vineyards, for example. So they came and they settled and they started to take up local culture and even language, because by the 8th century, the Lombard language actually disappeared. So, we have no real written trace of what kind of language they actually spoke, although we can assume it was something akin to, Anglo-Saxon, Old English, or Proto-Germanic, or one of those Germanic languages, let's say.
That's a pretty quick move. Within less than 200 years, they had pretty much lost their language. What about in their other aspects of culture? And we can maybe move into their religion a little bit, because that went through some big changes. Culturally, how did they change from when they had entered to that, not very long afterwards, maybe a century or two?
Well, they changed in many things. Some things they maintained. They were very proud of their appearance, for example. Going back to the whole story of the long beards, they would actually shave the back of their heads all the way up to their scalp and keep long hair in the front sort of divided, parted down the middle. So if you have the opportunity to see images and pictures of the Lombards, they have these strange style, let's say. Women adapted maybe to local Byzantine Roman style a bit more quickly, whereas the men, the warrior class, the nobles, maintained their fashion for a bit longer. But as we were saying, linguistically speaking, they needed to communicate with their new subjects, so they soon found that communication was easier in initially Latin, but by that time we're not talking the Latin, the classical Latin of Cicero or Tacitus, but we're talking about sort of proto-Italian, or what is called here as vulgar Italian, vulgarization of the Latin language. And so also the laws and the money they would have used would have from the very start been the solidus, the Roman solidus, when they did obviously use money, because they would also use barter systems, and we can't think of a regular economic system back in the early Middle Ages. And so a lot of the characteristics of the Lombards slowly integrated into the local population, with some little quirks, let's say, like fashion and that. But in time, you could say that by the 9th and 10th century, when you use the term Lombard prince or Lombard duke, you're almost speaking of an Italian by that point. Also, linguistically, culturally speaking.
Did much of their culture rub off on the native population? Did much go the other way?
Not really, especially because the most important element, perhaps the warrior culture, the culture that brought to the whole chivalry business, the business of knights, didn't really catch in Italy at any time. Indeed, if you look for, stories of Arthur and chivalry, you find them in French literature, you find them in English literature, in Germanic literature, the Siegfrieds and the Arthurs and so on, but you don't find a lot of that in Italian literature. So, this whole idea of the warrior, of the knight, etc., which is, going a bit too far perhaps, is also one of the reasons the Normans were able to so quickly take a hold in southern Italy later on. Yeah, there are a couple of examples of words, maybe, some peculiar ones. So in Italian we say federa, which is a pillowcase, which is of Lombard origin. Vasca, so if you go and have a bath, you would go in a vasca, which is a tub, a bathtub. Or bara, interestingly, which is a coffin. These are all Lombard words. And going back to hair, also the word forfora, which is the word for dandruff, would have been of Lombard origin as well. So some words, some things, but coming down to our times, not a huge amount of influence. Although, as I said, with the Edict of Rothery, in legal terms, the laws of the Lombards held sway for quite a few centuries. Up until the 12th century, you could still find traces of Lombard law. So that's, almost 600 years after King Rothery of the Lombards set out his edict. So definitely in the, let's say, closer to the Lombard presence, they had a more significant influence. Then obviously over the years, not so much.
This is going way, way, way into the future of where we are right now. But did they have much impact, the Lombards, in how that northern part of Italy would develop and say like you said, into maybe like the 1200s with like the famous families of like the Sforza, etc.? Was there any linkage between them?
Well, you'd have to consider maybe how much the idea of independence caught hold. I mean, is that something which was naturally already developing in the Italian cities, or is that something the Lombards brought in? I would tend to think it's sort of a combination, because when the Western Roman Empire fell, the only actors available to fill that vacuum were the bishops. So the bishops of the various Italian cities. And that was the first moment in which the cities and the areas moved towards independence. Then obviously when the Lombards came in and they sort of, how can we say, overlaid their idea of independence to that. It only increased. So, the Duke of Turin or the Duke of Pavia or the Duke of Verona would be following his interests. At times would coincide with that of the king, and many other times wouldn't. When the Lombards fell, a lot of the dukes actually stayed on in their positions because they had actually sided with the Franks. So I would think that in a way they continued that, how can we say, that strive or that movement towards independence, which really characterized the Italian Middle Ages and then the Italian Renaissance. I mean, you could say that Italy has contributed all it contributed, with art, science, and so on, due to a lack of unity, unfortunately. So, yeah, I would say in a certain sense that you could say that they continued that push towards independence from a central power that so characterized, the Italian Middle Ages and the Italian communal period.
I think the Lombards, rather, their religion is so fascinating because apparently, at least some scholars think that before they had entered the Italian peninsula, they were kind of a grab bag of mostly Catholic Christians with some pagans, so a pagan Catholic mix. But then when they came into Italy, that's where they started to become more Aryan in outlook as they were trying to absorb the Ostrogoths that were there, which that's kind of a big move, and that's a political move, but it didn't really last very long. There's even some thought that in general they weren't very Aryan to begin with, that they were way more heavily Catholic, but that the popes and the Catholics were using that as sort of a cudgel to hit them with to get more Byzantine support. And then eventually, when the Byzantines couldn't really do anything anymore, to get the Franks involved.
Yeah, we had early examples of Arian kings and even some early examples of Arian kings prohibiting Catholic practices, and later on down the line also a Catholic king being deposed for the very fact that he was Catholic and so too integrated with the local population. Then we have some interesting examples of Arian kings but with Catholic wives. So in the case of, for example, Agilulf and Theodelinda, which is a very important queen, a very important figure in Lombard history. So yeah, they sort of, as you said, it doesn't seem like they had a strong conviction one way or another from a religious point of view, but it seems more of a political question. And I think you're right in that assessment.
I thought it was interesting. There was a king who, it had always been Catholic practice that Arians who converted back to Catholicism wouldn't need to be rebaptized. Whereas the Arian practice was that Catholics who became Arian had to be rebaptized. So they were making it a bigger hurdle and making it kind of a bigger deal of the amount of heresy, depending on which perspective you're looking at it. To the Arians, Catholicism was a bigger heresy than Arianism was to the Catholics.
Yeah, exactly.
At least in that one little segment of time. It almost seemed to me like doing the research on the Lombards, they got into Arianism just a little bit too late, and that history probably would have been quite different if they had become Catholic more quickly. Then there wouldn't have been as much of an impetus for the Franks to come in and for the papacy to find a new Catholic ally and make the Lombards the enemy. Yeah,
definitely. Although, I mean, I think the contingency, the fact they were so close to what by a certain point had become actually papal states, wouldn't have made that much a difference. I think, the fact was that now the Pope had a state and he had a power all around that state, which in this case was the Lombards, which was encroaching on his state. So I think whatever religion they would have been, even if they had been Catholic, it would have caused some kind of problem for him. Although, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing to consider, how much could the Lombards had done if they had been Catholic, if they hadn't had the threat of the Franks over them. Maybe they could have created an Italian state that could have rivaled the formation of France, the formation of Germany, and, not, let's say, I'm thinking the word condemned, but, it's not exactly true, but, sacrificing Italy to, several centuries of domination from foreign powers. Maybe they could have created an Italian nation back then, but, that's the what-ifs of history. So you can go very far down that road and not be able to come back.
Yeah, I think you're right, though, that they had that immediate conflict. And even if they were co-religionists, the fact that they were muscling in on the Pope's territory was always going to be a major conflict area. Definitely.
Although it is also interesting that, if you want to try and trace the origin of the papal states, you can go to different areas. You can go to Gregory the Great. But one area you can go is the donation of Sutri, which was, by a Lombard king, Liutprand, to the Pope. Because what had happened was Liutprand had taken, among other areas, the city of Sutri near Rome from the Byzantines. But when the time came to reach an agreement with the Pope, Liutprand didn't give Sutri back to the Byzantines, but he gave it directly to the Pope. So you had a king giving land in a legitimate, let's say, way to the Pope, and so, in a certain sense, creating a legitimate landholding by the popes. Then, obviously, you have other moments, very important moments, perhaps more important moments, such as, the donation of Pippin or the confirmation by Charlemagne of the donation of Pippin. But, the donation of Sutri is an interesting example in which the Lombard king helped, in a certain sense, to create the papal states, which then were the thorn in his side that, pushed the whole Lombard kingdom to fall.
Yeah, I really think the Lombards were like a key that opened the door to what the papacy would become, this weird alliance with the Franks that went on for centuries. And then it also leads into the whole Guelph-Ghibelline conflict. Everything gets opened when the Lombards come, and the papacy has to find an ally somewhere, and it winds up being the Franks.
Yeah, then not to mention the whole issue with the Holy Roman Empire and the investiture crisis that you've done an episode on as well. So that's a whole funny mess as well to think about.
What happened to the Lombards in the southern part of Italy? They sacked Monte Cassino, and as you said, they became dukes in Benevento, Spoleto. What happened to their kingdom after the kingdom in the north was taken out by the Franks?
Well, they started out actually as duchies. So, when the initial conquest came, they were made dukes of Spoleto and Benevento. And interestingly, when the northern kingdom fell, so it fell under King Desiderius of the Lombards, when he was defeated by Charlemagne, that would be 774, I would say. And basically the southern areas, who were in a certain sense protected because they had, if you can imagine the papal states, you have the area obviously around Rome, and then you have the area around Ravenna, sort of north east of Rome, and basically a little corridor through the mountains, through the Apennines, connecting those two areas. So that was almost like a buffer for the existing Lombard southern duchies. And so, they toyed with the idea for a little bit of actually declaring a kingdom. So they thought, well, maybe that's going to be a little bit too risky. We don't want the Franks coming and disturbing us. So they just called themselves princes. So the duchies of Spoleto and Benevento became principalities. Obviously, by then we had other players. It wasn't just Spoleto and Benevento, but you also had the growing importance of cities like Salerno, Gaeta, for example, and Naples. Naples was still nominally Byzantine, but also has started to have local aspirations. So basically they lived on, you could say. They continued on. basically until the Norman conquest of southern Italy. So we're talking the 11th century, and they continue to fight amongst themselves. They continue to at times side with the papacy, at times fight against the Saracens, so the Arab presence in Sicily, at times with them. So, enjoying themselves on a day-by-day basis of who am I going to ally with today, until basically the Norman conquest, as I said.
Yeah, so many things happened so quickly. The Byzantine Ostrogothic War, and then the Lombards come in. Then they get taken over by the Franks in the late 700s. Then the Saracens come. Within 200 years, the whole world had changed.
Exactly. Well, that's what happened with the fall of the empire. Then that opened the floodgates for any kind of invaders, and things continued to happen in Italy for many centuries. It remained divided basically until 1860. So you'd always have somebody in the south, which was different from somebody in the center, which was different from the presence in the north. And, actually, if you want to look at a map of Italy today, we're still not united, because you have Italy with two mini states in it, which is the Vatican on one hand and the Republic of San Marino on the other. So you could say that the situation continued on until this day, basically, although obviously with very, very different characteristics.
Where did San Marino actually come from? Does that have any connection to this story?
Not with the Lombards, no. It came a lot later. It was basically in the pre-unification period. It wasn't a little, as was the case in that time, a little independent. I believe it was a duchy at that time, and basically out of because Giuseppe Garibaldi had sought exile there, and he'd been given exile and support. So when the time came to unify Italy, they were sitting up there on their hilltop, so harmless. No, they weren't interfering one way or the other. So Garibaldi was able to intervene to allow them to remain an independent republic. Basically, obviously, it became a republic later, and to this day, it's more of a tourist thing. You can't really say that they're a big independent nation, but they have their own football team when the World Cup comes around, and you have a little passport. You can have your passport stamped when you drive into San Marino. So it's more of a tourist thing than actual, significantly a different country.
I think that we really did wrap up and gave people a good taste of what each of our podcasts have to offer. I think if they want to learn more about the detail of all of these issues, definitely tune into your podcast. And I'm really enjoying this series with the Arrivederci, the Saracens. And,
yeah.
One question I did have, I love those little sketches you do at the end. Where did those come from?
I was trying to think. Well, obviously dramatizing history is nothing new, because, it's been done forever. That's the way people used to tell history. And obviously Shakespeare, with all his historical plays. I think that I sort of copied it from A History of England. And so I did it early on. And I remember early on, I had a listener write in and say, I love the podcast, but I feel that the sketches don't really fit in much. So I stopped doing them for a while, but then I like the idea of bringing them back in. So I put them at the end. That way, it doesn't interrupt the flow of the episode. And if you don't want to listen to it, you can stop listening after the end music, let's say. But I still kept it there because we enjoy doing that. That's all my family is involved in that. There's my wife sometimes, my children. And so we enjoy that little extra sketch at the end there.
I also love how you keep the episodes to 15, 20, 25 minutes. Is that something you really work hard to stick to?
Yeah, it comes relatively naturally, because basically once I see that I follow the character count. So once I see I'm up to about 10,000 characters, I know that, I can either wrap it up or cut it in two, and that works pretty well, I think. Yeah, it's sort of half studied. I was, as I said initially, I used to listen. Well, I still listen to your podcast. I listen to other podcasts that run up to, well, obviously the history of Rome, which used to run about half an hour. So then I sort of chose a middle ground, because here in Italy, for example, a podcast shouldn't go more than 10 minutes, the Italian language podcast. So sort of a middle ground, let's say. It allows one listen on an average commute, maybe a couple of episodes on the longer commute. So yeah, it's also, it's pretty easy to get one out a week at that length. If it were longer, it would be hard, I think, to do one a week. What about you, Steve? What sort of approach or philosophy have you used for your episode length?
I really try for about a half an hour. Sometimes I get a little windbaggy and go further, but I really do try to stick to about a half an hour. I think, like you said, that's about a commute. It's, if somebody goes for a little jog or something, that's probably about in the half an hour range. Like I said, that is really how I try to do it.
Yeah, I think it works that way. Yeah. The feedback seems to be good on that in that sense as well. So,
if people want to find your podcast, and they definitely should, like and subscribe, where can they find your show?
Well, it's hosted on a website, which is www.ahistoryofitaly.com. But then you can find it on all of the major podcatchers, pod players, pod things. So Apple, Google podcasts, and so on and so forth, on Patreon. At patreon.com/ahistoryofitaly, and there I have also some extra content. I have a little series called News Cappuccino on little quirks about Italy in the week, or Italian history, or just an Italian point of view on world issues, and some videos and extra content there. And for the listeners of A History of Italy, Steve, where can we listen to the history of the papacy and other projects that you have as well?
You can find you can listen and then find all the social media and all that sort of thing on my website, a2zhistorypage.com, ATOZhistorypage.com. And you can also find the podcast on all your usual podcatchers. I believe I'm on Stitcher now, iTunes, Apple Podcasts. I also have another podcast that is not regularly updated, but I do actually have a little series coming out on my other podcast called Beyond the Big Screen, where I interview guests about a movie and we discuss the background and history of what mostly historical movies, where what they were at, what actually happened, and a little bit of what the movie changed and maybe what we liked and disliked about the movie. So that's a good podcast, and there's a pretty decent back catalog. And like I said, I'll have a few new episodes coming out on that as well.
Great, yeah. Then maybe they'll make a film about the Lombards sometime, and we can review that one.
Oh yeah, I'd love that. There's a lot of topics that I think would make really good movies, and then they usually wind up making another World War II movie.
Yeah. Yes. Great. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for proposing this collaboration. I think it's really, really enjoyable and really great.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I think there's going to be a lot of other opportunities for our to collaborate and catch up each of our audiences on some different aspects of church history and Italian history. Yeah,
one thing I'm looking forward to you getting to is the whole investiture. I mean, I know you've done an episode on it, but, when you get more into Gregory the Seventh, because, if I turn around and look out my window, I can actually see the hills of Canossa. So I look forward to collaborating maybe on that, on Gregory the Seventh and Matilda and Henry the Fourth and all that.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That's definitely something I'm looking forward to from both of our podcasts.
Great. Fantastic.
All right. Thanks for talking with me.
Same here. Thank you very much. And thank you to the listeners of A History of Italy and the listeners of A History of the Papacy.